Mean neighbor Sarah stopped a sad family's funeral cars on the street. She stood in front of the hearse and wouldn't let them take Grandma to her final resting place. Police came and took Sarah away in handcuffs. Now she's in big trouble for breaking the law. Before watching full video, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more Karen stories. Sarah Miller had lived in the peaceful Pinewood Estates neighborhood for nearly 30 years. She knew every family, every pet, and certainly every rule in the Homeowners Association handbook. As the HOA president for the past decade, she took her job very seriously, perhaps too seriously according to most residents. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah was tending to her perfectly manicured front garden when she noticed something unusual on Maple Street. A line of cars with purple funeral flags was slowly making its way through the neighborhood. Leading the procession was a hearse, followed by a limousine carrying a grieving family. Sarah frowned. No one had informed the HOA about a funeral procession passing through Pinewood Estates. According to Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA guidelines, all unusual traffic events required prior written approval. Without hesitation, Sarah dropped her gardening gloves, straightened her floral blouse and marched toward the street. The procession was moving at a respectful pace of about 15 miles per hour, well below the neighborhood speed limit, but that wasn't the point. Rules were rules. Sarah positioned herself in the middle of the road and held up her hand like a traffic officer. The hearse driver, a solemn-faced man in his 50s, looked confused as he slowly applied the brakes. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, her voice sharp and authoritative. "You need permission to conduct a procession through this neighborhood. Do you have written approval from the HOA?" The driver lowered his window. "Ma'am, this is a funeral procession for Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins. We're heading to Oakwood Cemetery." "I don't care if it's the president's funeral," Sarah replied. "You need proper authorization. This is private property governed by a homeowners association." By now the entire procession had come to a halt. The family members in the limousine behind the hearse looked out with expressions of disbelief and growing anger. "Ma'am, please," the driver pleaded. "The cemetery is just 2 blocks away. We're almost there." Sarah crossed her arms. "You'll have to find another route or present the proper documentation. I can't allow this to continue." What Sarah didn't know was that among the mourners was James Wilson, a retired judge who had spent 40 years on the bench. As the confrontation continued, he stepped out of his car and approached Sarah. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I'm Judge Wilson. What you're doing is not only incredibly disrespectful but also illegal in this state. Interfering with a funeral procession is a criminal offense." Sarah scoffed. "I know the law and I know our HOA rules. This neighborhood," Judge Wilson interrupted, "is subject to state law which protects funeral processions. Now, I suggest you step aside before someone calls the police." Sarah wasn't used to being challenged. For years, residents had simply followed her rules to avoid confrontation. She stood her ground. "Go ahead and call them. I'm protecting our community standards." Judge Wilson nodded solemnly and pulled out his phone. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers arrived at the scene. Officer Martinez and Officer Chin quickly assessed the situation. "Ma'am, we've received reports that you're blocking a funeral procession," Officer Martinez said. "I'm enforcing our HOA rules," Sarah insisted. "They didn't get permission." Officer Chin shook his head. "Ma'am, under state law, funeral processions have the right of way, and interfering with them is a Class B misdemeanor. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside immediately." Sarah's face flushed red. "This is ridiculous. I'm the HOA president." "That doesn't place you above the law," Officer Martinez replied. "Please move aside now or we'll have to place you under arrest." Sarah refused to budge. "I want to speak to your supervisor." The officers exchanged glances. Officer Chin took out his handcuffs. "Sarah Miller, you're under arrest for unlawful interference with a funeral procession and disorderly conduct." As the officers led a protesting Sarah to the police car, neighbors emerged from their homes, many filming the incident on their phones. The funeral procession resumed its journey to Oakwood Cemetery, where Eleanor Jenkins was finally laid to rest, 30 minutes behind schedule. News of Sarah's arrest spread quickly through Pinewood Estates. That evening, a video of the incident was uploaded to social media, where it quickly went viral. Local news stations picked up the story, running headlines like, "HOA Karen HIJACKS funeral procession gets arrested." 3 days later, Sarah was released on bail, facing criminal charges and returning to a neighborhood that was no longer willing to tolerate her extreme rule enforcement. When she checked her mail, she found a notice for an emergency HOA meeting. The community center was packed that Friday evening. Nearly every resident of Pinewood Estates had come to the meeting, which had only one item on the agenda: the removal of Sarah Miller as HOA president. "For years, we've put up with increasingly unreasonable rules and enforcement," said Robert Thompson, the HOA vice president. "But interfering with a funeral procession crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. It's not just about breaking the law, it's about basic human decency." One by one, residents stood up to share their own experiences with Sarah's excessive rule enforcement. Citations for garbage bins left out 5 minutes too long, fines for flowers that weren't on the approved color list, threats over holiday decorations deemed too festive. Sarah sat in stunned silence as the community she thought she had been protecting turned against her. When it came time to vote, the result was unanimous. Sarah Miller was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The following week, Sarah appeared in court to face charges of interfering with a funeral procession and disorderly conduct. Judge Wilson had recused himself from the case due to his involvement, but his colleague, Judge Patricia Ramirez, presided instead. "Ms. Miller," Judge Ramirez said after hearing the evidence, "this court finds your actions not only legally wrong but morally reprehensible. A funeral procession represents one of the most solemn moments in life, deserving of respect and dignity." Sarah was sentenced to 100 hours of community service, specifically volunteering at Oakwood Cemetery, and ordered to pay a $2,500 fine. As part of her sentence, Sarah was also required to attend a community impact hearing, where members of Eleanor Jenkins' family shared how her actions had affected what should have been a peaceful final journey for their loved one. "My mother was a kind woman who never broke a rule in her life," said Eleanor's daughter, Maria. "She would have been the first person to get proper permission if she had known it was needed. But in her final journey, she was treated like a trespasser." Over the next 6 months, as Sarah completed her community service at Oakwood Cemetery, something unexpected happened. Working among the graves, helping families find their loved ones' resting places, and witnessing grief firsthand changed her perspective. She began to understand that rules, while important, should never override compassion. When her community service ended, Sarah did something no one expected. She attended an HOA meeting, this time as a regular resident, and publicly apologized. "I lost sight of why rules exist in the first place," she admitted. "They're meant to help us live together harmoniously, not to control and punish. I especially want to apologize to the Jenkins family for adding pain to what was already a difficult day." The new HOA president, Elena Gonzalez, had implemented a different approach to community management. The handbook had been simplified, reducing the number of regulations by half and focusing on meaningful rules that protected property values while respecting individual expression. "We're calling it the Jenkins Rule," Elena explained. "It simply states that compassion takes precedence over regulation. I think it's something we can all live by." 1 year after the incident, Pinewood Estates had transformed. Neighbors talked to each other more, gardens showed more variety, and holiday decorations brightened the winter months. The story of HOA Karen remained a cautionary tale, but it had evolved into something more valuable: a lesson about community, forgiveness, and the importance of seeing beyond the rulebook to the human beings affected by our actions. As for Sarah Miller, she still lived in Pinewood Estates, now serving on the neighborhood's newly formed Compassionate Community Committee. Her garden was still beautiful, but these days she was more likely to be found helping neighbors with theirs than measuring their grass height with a ruler. Sometimes, it takes a moment of public shame and legal consequences to spark genuine change. And sometimes, justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation.